الله بالخير. من بين أنقاض غزة إلى دهاليز القوى العظمى زلزال عالمي يتشكل ترفض وسائل الإعلام الرسمية تسميته المقاومة تنتصر. فبينما تضج العناوين الرئيسية بالفوضى والدمار، تنقش في الوعي العالمي ملحمة انتصار أعمق لا رجعة عنها. لم ينجو المقاومون من آلة حرب على طراز الناتو فحسب، بل حولوا الصهيونية إلى متهم مكروه أمام العالم، وأسروا الباب جيل بأكمله من الجامعات الأمريكية إلى الجنوب العالمي وقوافل الصمود. حرب الإبادة الإسرائيلية ارتدت عليها، تنهش مجتمعها من الداخل وتشعل تمردا في صفوف الشباب الغربي الذين كانوا يوما عمادها. هل يشهد العالم بداية النهاية للمشروع الصهيوني ليس بضربة عسكرية أخيرة، بل بانهيار بطيء لا هوادة فيه نتيجة لإفلاسه الأخلاقي وإرادة وثبات أولئك الذين سعى إلى محوهم؟ هل النصر الحقيقي للمقاومة هو في تحطيم شرعية إسرائيل وخلخلة قبضتها على الوعي الأمريكي؟ أليست إسرائيل بعنفها الأعمى وتصلب غطرستها تحيك بيدها انتحارها الديمغرافي والسياسي وتسرع سقوطها الحتمي؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر مع أبي مارتن، الإعلامية والناشطة السياسية الأمريكية في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب الصفار، خليكم ويانا. Abby Martin, journalist, activist and filmmaker. Salam and welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is the proximate aspect. Pure pleasure to have you, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me.
Always a pleasure. Well, Gaza, the most surveilled, bombed and silent strip of land on earth, yet its story refuses to die. Abby, your work has torn through propaganda to expose a genocide broadcast live without regard to international law and with no deterrence. Define, please, genocide in this context, and what evidence compels you to use that word, even though so many Western journalists, pundits and officials still dare not to use it?
I mean, I'll defer to legal experts such as Francesca Albanese to, her body of work, the ICJ ruling that happened just months after this genocide began, with 5 pages or more just marking the genocidal intent, which of course is one of the hardest things to prove in these cases. Certainly not in the case of Israel. We have pages and pages ever since that document was submitted, dozens of pages of just actual blatant citations of the genocidal intent of Israeli leaders. I mean, this continues on to this day. So while people like Bernie Sanders finally came on board in agreement with the UN ruling 2 years into this, anyone who has been witnessing what has been happening on the ground, which is the wanton destruction, the intent to destroy an entire culture, every single aspect and facet of Palestinian life in Gaza, coupled with the ecocidal, ecological devastation. 1 million of 1.1 million olive trees have been completely destroyed. So all of the green space of what was once a vibrant wetland, the intentional destruction of the desalination plants, I mean, everything, when you couple it together, it is so clear as day that it is genocide, as well as every single genocide scholar, including Israeli scholars on genocide and the Holocaust, agree. Every single human rights organization, on the planet, and every single organization that deals with international law has declared as such. So anyone who's denying this is just denying reality at this point. And we know that genocide is the most grievous crime a state can commit. So my question is, how has it not been stopped at this point?
Right. Abby, you constantly refuse to condemn October 7th operation and the resistance. Today, after the Sharm el-Sheikh summit and the Trump deal, do you believe that the resistance won or lost? And was the operation worth all this destruction, displacement and martyrs, as some might argue?
Well, that will be up to the Palestinians to decide. I'm not Palestinian, but I can just say that, at this point, I think it's really absurd to have the inverted reality that we're looking at today, where Hamas and other armed factions within Gaza have been asked to demilitarize in order to, quote unquote, attain peace. Why is it that the entity that has been the victims of genocide for 2 years, and I would argue actually 77 years, the slow drip genocide of Zionism in general, why is it that that entity, which are victims of a modern day Holocaust, why is it that they're being asked to demilitarize? And we know that this is all a farce. They had offered to release the hostages within a month. So all of the tens of thousands of martyrs, all of the people who have been slaughtered needlessly, 20,000 children at least, of course, they didn't need to die. Of course, Israel didn't need to do this. They couldn't help but go full genocidal. It didn't matter what happened on October 7th. They would have used any precursor and pretense to go full genocidal and take the Gaza Strip and annex the rest of the West Bank. They were just waiting. They were waiting. So it didn't matter what Hamas did or didn't do. We know that they were offering to offer up the hostages within a month. So at this point, it's really hard to say. But I think that we all can agree that Israel has always reneged on every ceasefire deal. They will never adhere to any sort of peace settlement. And they have already killed dozens of Palestinians in blatant violation of the ceasefire deal. And they're continuing to basically not declare to withdraw. So it was a huge let up for Hamas to say, here's all the hostages. We're just going to act in good faith and just trust the Israeli state. They lie about everything. And we know that they're lying about this. They just want all of Gaza. And this is why they took 2 years to do this.
Right. In this context, the Trump plan promised economic revival. You've argued it's actually an economic weapon. What's the proximate aspect here, Abby? What did you see in that plan that convinced you it was designed to repackage occupation, not end it? And do you think it will hold?
No, I do not think it will hold. I think Israel should not be trusted, and it should be disarmed immediately and demilitarized. I mean, this is a genocidal nuclear-armed state that is
but these
continuing
are
to
only
bomb every
dreams,
single neighbor
Abby.
and renege on every single ceasefire negotiation. I mean, when you look at the actual peace deal, look at what they're talking about. Jared Kushner, who's personally profiting off of the settlements, Netanyahu's cabinet. There's no Palestinian at the negotiating table about what is the resettlement process going to look like? What is the restructuring, rebuilding, reconstructing process going to look like? When you look at the fine details, it's about the actual Israeli-controlled areas, not the Palestinian-controlled areas. So again, we're going back to an apartheid system, a perpetual occupation within Gaza with these yellow lines that they're saying Israelis can rebuild among these yellow lines. But of course, Palestinians are going to be subject to another set of laws, a two-tiered system where they're barely going to get food, aid, and medicine, just like they have been since the siege was imposed on them in 2007.
But do you ever think that Israel would be, if all the free people of the world called for a demilitarized Israel, do you think that this would ever happen?
Well, that's why, as an American citizen, I understand that Israel is only a puppet of the U.S. imperialist system and the U.S. military empire that's being imposed by my government, subjugating tens of millions of people around the world. And that's why, as an American, I can only do what I can to lobby my government.
Exactly.
We can't do anything about what Israel is doing unless we stop the American government from arming and subsidizing these genocidal policies. We've seen at the UN Security Council vote. We know what the other countries are willing to do and what they're willing to not do to step up to the United States, which is the real threat to the world here. We are the only reason that Israel is allowed to do what it's doing.
Exactly. Now, today, is the world witnessing the beginning of the end so to say, for the Zionist project, not by a final military blow perhaps, but by a slow and ruthless collapse from its own moral bankruptcy and the unyielding will of those it sought incessantly to erase and annihilate.
Yes, I've heard it said that, Zionism, not only is it predicated on just genocide and ethnic cleansing, so it's not a winnable strategy or ideology for peace. But aside from that, Zionism, on its face, the only thing that it knows how to do to survive is kill and kill and kill and to stay in the same place. That's not a winning strategy. That's why it's had to invest tens of billions of dollars into PR and propaganda to invert reality, to pretend like up is down and black is white for the last 50 plus years. But people have completely woken up to the nature of Israel. This is what Israel really is. This is what it's always wanted to do. We see the nature of Israeli society. We see the polling. This is not just anecdotal. We know that BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and a giant movement outside to isolate Israel is the only thing that will bring down apartheid. And this is what's worked in the past with South Africa. I do think that we are seeing the beginning of the end of the Zionist state. It can no longer survive. We cannot accept as a global community an apartheid Jim Crow style segregated state that exists on occupation and bloodletting and genocide and bombing campaigns. We're seeing the state refuses to stop expanding, refuses to stop bombing, and reneges on every ceasefire negotiation with all of its neighbors. So at this point, it cannot be trusted. It cannot be trusted with nuclear arms. And we cannot cooperate with a state like this. We cannot collaborate with a state like this in the global community.
Right.
So I think that it is the beginning of the end. Certainly when it comes to the propaganda, people have woken up and there is no going back. And now the entire community and the entire world at large know that this is an apartheid state committing genocide. And now the conversation has to become, what can be done? How can we hold those crimes accountable?
In a similar vein, Abby, has the resistance to victory been not on the battlefield, but in permanently shattering Israel's legitimacy and its grip on the American psyche and ethos today? Is Israel's relentless violence ultimately engineering its own demographic and political suicide and demise?
Of course. I mean, whenever you kill scores of people, those people's relatives and generational spawn will grow up wanting revenge and wanting to take down the entity that destroyed all of their lives and futures. And the countless victims of this genocide, Palestinians are good-natured people. They are the most resilient and beautiful people in the world. But all of this is going to result in untold amounts of horror and terror and generational trauma that will be unending. And I think that the resistance, you just have to look at polling in the United States, which is, of course, the hub of Zionism. And you look at polling here, young Jews, not just young Americans, young Jews sympathize with Hamas, not just Palestine, Hamas over Israel. That's how much they've lost the plot. That's how much they've lost the propaganda
In
war.
talking about
There's no going back.
Excuse me, allow me to jump in here. In talking about the youth, across the world, youth are marching actually from college campuses to digital spaces, to free people of the world, to the Samud flotilla, chanting Free Palestine. Abby, my first question, why is it that young people across continents see through propaganda faster than others? And B, is this a rebirth of global anti-colonial consciousness or just another viral cycle with no real consequence?
I think to answer your first question, young people are plugged into social media. They are no longer being dictated to by tech overlords or Silicon Valley giants or Barry Weiss on CBS. We're not looking for corporate media to tell us the news. We're not looking at the New York Times to tell us what Palestinians think and believe. We're looking at Palestinians telling their own stories, dictating their own narratives for the first time. They never had that agency before. That's why we see the urgency to censor their voices and to consolidate these narratives on social media, because that's why we know we can just turn on our phones and we see Palestinians telling us. And that's gorgeous and that's amazing and inspiring and motivating to me. To answer your second question, this is something that I have never seen before. This is not a fad. This is not a trend. This is a resurgence and a burgeoning of an explosion of anti-colonial consciousness and resistance that has an international lens of solidarity. I have never seen Americans sustained for 2 years into civil disobedience actions. I have never seen Americans, even during the Iraq War resistance, have that international lens of solidarity with Palestinian brothers, Yemeni brothers, Sudanese brothers and sisters, understanding how we are all victims of global imperialism, how all of these struggles are intertwined and connected. And that's why my new goal is to try to intertwine the environmental movement with the anti-imperialist movement and understand how the ecological devastation of Gaza will impact everyone on the planet. And all of these issues are tied together. And I think people are really, really waking up to that and acting accordingly.
Let's talk now Venezuela. The U.S. planned land strikes against so-called designated narco-terrorists, or as the rest of the world put differently, strikes on Venezuela. How do you read this provocation, Abby, by the U.S. empire meddling in other nations under certain pretexts?
It's just another horrifying overstep. Imperial crimes being broadcast daily. I mean, these are snuff films of Pete Hegseth bragging, who's now the secretary of, the leader of the Department of War. And I'm happy that they are now lifting the pretense and showing the world exactly who we are, which is an imperial chauvinist empire, a military empire that will kill anyone who gets in its way, and will send a very clear message to the world that we can extrajudicially slaughter anyone at any time, put it on camera, and broadcast it for the world. Because we, in terms of the United States government, operate extra legally and extrajudicially. These, a dozen or so airstrikes on these fishermen boats. Again, 37 people have died in these airstrikes off the coast of Venezuela in a clear provocation of war, clearly trying to invoke some sort of hostile aggression so we can justify regime change, which the United States has been trying to do ever since Hugo Chavez won the election in 2002. There has been coup after coup attempt, seizure after seizure attempt to try to rob Venezuela blind of its oil, including the installation of a fake puppet, Juan Guaido, over the authority of Maduro, who is a legitimate democratically elected president that happens to oversee the largest oil reserves in the world. So when we're looking at a military empire that survives on fossil fuel, it's very clear that the intention of getting Venezuela's oil is the goal here. But these provocations and these bombings of these boats where they're killing dozens of fishermen with no trial or due process is just a horrifying example of the lengths that the U.S. empire will go to further its goals.
Right. How free is free speech in the US of A today, Abby? What is your perspective as a journalist who helped found civilian journalism and who has been through legal battles over free speech?
Right now, Americans are faced with a very serious predicament, which is that our free speech rights are being undermined daily, not only from these anti-BDS laws that Israeli consulate and lobby officials have gone and sought to undermine our sacred First Amendment constitutionally enshrined rights at state legislatures under the guise of anti-Semitism to usurp our fundamental First Amendment, the right to boycott, the right to talk freely about critiques of foreign countries that are committing genocide and apartheid with my tax dollars. But aside from that, we see a very worrisome trend where now if you just voice things about Charlie Kirk, if you simply are critiquing U.S. foreign policy, this is kind of a catch-all now where it doesn't even matter if you are just a resident. Now there's threats if you're a legal citizen of this country, if you are simply saying things that the government does not like. Again, this is a heralded, cherished right that is sacred, right? This is the right that the United States actually touts to invade other countries and install plants and dictators in other countries because they claim that they don't have free speech. They don't have the right to assembly, while they are suppressing and repressing our most sacred right here. So it is, again, extremely hypocritical, extremely dystopian and draconian and terrifying to think of where this can go. Trump has not even been in office for a year, and we're already seeing our most sacred constitutionally held rights being eroded before our eyes, where at any point in the day, I am worried about the federal government coming and knocking on my door and seizing my devices. That's the state of America.
Abby, there's a sense of a war of words when journalists use phrases like, for example, quote unquote, Hamas wrong Gaza, Israel's right to defend itself, or tragic collateral damage. What are they really doing linguistically here?
Look, all I'll say is that genocide does not happen in a vacuum. Genocide only happens because the propagandists seed the consent for genocide. When we're looking at the New York Times and there's painfully constructed haikus to absolve the entity murdering and slaughtering, to absolve the occupying force committing genocide, and to paint the victims as untrustworthy, that is intentional. That is a crime. That should be held accountable. This does not happen without the concerted effort from the corporate media structure to sow the seeds, to manufacture the consent. I just read a Pew poll back in May of the first year that the genocide was going on. Half of Americans didn't know if more Israelis died than Palestinians in the entirety of the conflict. Whose fault is that? That is the egregious propaganda from my corporate media. That is essentially an arm of the state. They are activated whenever manufacturing consent needs to happen, and they are activated here. It is so dystopian and disproportionate when it comes to Gaza reporting.
But Abby, Israel supporters often say Gaza's suffering is quote unquote tragic but complex. Is complexity the new weapon of obfuscation in genocidal politics?
It's just a war of rhetoric and words. This is the propaganda that's made it so overly difficult to talk about this issue, but it's the most simple issue in the world. It's the most clear-cut issue in the world. It's an occupation that is illegal. And this occupying force is besieging a population in a ghetto and committing genocide against them. In what reality would 2.3 million Jewish people be allowed to be caged inside of an Arab nation, half children, cut off their electricity and water, and then indiscriminately bomb them for 2 years? In what reality in our world would that be allowed to be possible? It is only the nature of anti-Islam, anti-Muslim bigotry that has made this justified. It is absolutely abhorrent that we are 2 years into this and that people have just thought that this is a complicated issue. No, we've watched babies being starved. I've watched the skeletal remains of Palestinians being carried out by the dozens in trucks. I've watched Israel dumping out bodies that are unmarked, stealing their organs. This is not complicated. This is very simple. It is only due to propaganda and political censorship that Americans and also the world didn't know. This is the most documented atrocity of our time.
True.
And it is a disgrace that it took a genocide for people to wake up.
One last word for Gaza, Abby.
Gaza will be free. Palestine will be free. Zionism has a shelf life. Zionism cannot survive.
Right.
Democracy, freedom, rights, humanity, that is the future. Empathy is the future. Collective liberation, Palestinian liberation, is the cornerstone of humanity's collective liberation. And we've all woken up to that in the last 2 years.
Abby Martin, who helped found the Citizen Journalism. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer my questions. Have a good day, Abby.
Thank you.
جيل تائه في أمريكا اليوم، شباب غاضب مثقل بالديون عاجز حتى عن استئجار شقة أو شراء مستقبل، يراقبون حكومتهم تمول حرب الإبادة في غزة من مالهم بينما تضيق الخناق على جامعاتهم ومؤسساتهم بسبب العجز المالي. أزمة اقتصادية متفاقمة وخانقة، دين عام يتضخم وإغلاق حكومي يشل البلاد. جيل وعد بالحلم الأمريكي لكنه استيقظ على كابوس من الفقر والبطالة والذنب الأخلاقي، حيث ترسل القنابل إلى غزة باسم الديمقراطية. إذا كانت غزة مرآة أخلاقية لعصرنا، فماذا ستقول الأجيال المقبلة عندما تسأل من وقف متفرجا بينما يمحى شعب على الهواء مباشرة؟ فهل ما زالت أمريكا تملك ما تبشر به للعالم أم تحتاج أن تتعلم كيف تنقذ نفسها أولا؟ من كل الميادين حياكم.